Let's work it up there. Yes.
Just phoned me. Ready. Good evening, everybody, and welcome as always to Queen's for our last lecture of this year. And hopefully you'll be back next year. There's plenty more in store. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Eileen Murphy. Eileen's well known to most of us as Professor of Archaeology in the School of Natural and Built Environment here at Queen's, and also as the joint lead for the Centre of Community Archaeology, along with Colin Donnelly. Eileen is also Vice President of the UAS, and her research uses approaches from bioarchaeology and funerary archaeology to help further understanding of the lives of people from the past. And recently she's been concentrating her research on individuals from medieval Ireland, and is co-author with Shane Delaney of The Forgotten Cemetery at Ranelagh, County Roscommon, which was published in December 2022. It's available both in print and also as an ebook on tii.ie. You may also be interested to know that that book has been nominated for the CA Book of the Year, as is Barry Harpo's book on Balnahattie. So you've got, if you vote once, vote often, I suggest. Anyway, without further ado, I think we'll just get on and welcome Professor Eileen Murphy. Thanks very much, Eileen.
Hey, thanks, Anne, for that lovely introduction. Okay, so yes, this evening I'm going to talk about the cemetery at Ranelagh in County Roscommon. So what I want to do is give you a bit of an introduction to the site in general, and then I'll focus on some of the people that we've studied from that site. So firstly, where is Ranelagh located? And why are we studying? Why did we study this site? So basically, it was excavated as part of a road scheme. So in 2015, basically it was discovered as part of this road scheme, which had initiated in 2011. And it's just a few miles outside Roscommon town. And if you look, here's a site on the map, but you can see there's a bad bend associated with the site. So the N61 Coolteige Road scheme was initiated to try to improve road safety in that area. Now, it was very interesting because there was no physical expression or any records of the site at Ranelagh. So one of the things that we were interested in is, how did this come to be? Because as you'll see in this lecture, it is a major settlement cemetery, but it came to be erased from the landscape, and there's no public records and no folk memory of the site. So it was funded, all of this work was funded by Roscommon County Council and Transport Infrastructure Ireland. And I think it's been money very well spent, because it's enabled us to learn a huge amount about the people who use the settlement, as well as making the roads safe. So this is an aerial view of the site. So you can see it's pretty substantive. It was excavated over 54 weeks by Shane Delaney for IAC Ltd and his team. You can kind of get an idea, there's lots of pools of water in these ditches. So they were excavating, over winter and in some really nasty conditions. You can see there's a tent up. So they did an incredible job and, excavated to such a high standard and recorded these burials to such a level that we've been able to get a really huge amount of information. So the excavations found that the cemetery here had started life in the 4th century AD, and that it was used for over 1,000 years. And proper burial as such came to an end just after AD 1400. So during these eras, during the early medieval and into the sort of later medieval, it would have been a very prominent feature in both the sort of geographical and psychological landscape of the time. Now, just in general terms, we know that in the early medieval period, Irish society was very highly stratified. So you would have had, the semi-free, the free, and the noble classes, and then lots of other sort of subdivisions within these groups. We know that land ownership was based on kinship, and it would have been passed down along sort of patrilineal lines, so patriarchal, so it was quite a male-dominated society. These dynastic territories were controlled by kin groups, which were referred to as tuatha. And in this part of Roscommon, the Ubreen were one of these groups. So they would have been dominant in the Ranelagh area from about the 8th century. Now, an integral component of a tuath was a furta, or an ancestral burial place. And this is what we think we have at Ranelagh. People like Adele Brethnick have studied these and shown, they can take quite a variety of different forms. So you can have, maybe circular ditched enclosures like we've got here at Ranelagh, or you can have ring barrows or mounds, but they're generally referred to as settlement cemeteries, because when they're excavated, you find that there's, a range of sort of habitation and industrial sort of settlement evidence alongside the burials. And true enough, when Ranelagh was excavated, the remains of 557 articulated individuals were found. So I'm going to, like I said, talk you through the sort of different phases of Ranelagh. Basically, what we seem to have is that it began as a sort of a simple univariate sort of settlement cemetery enclosure. And over the centuries, it really changed its function and became, a lot larger and a lot grander. And then it sort of gradually died out. So this just shows you sort of a general plan of the site. So it's based on the geophysics. So you can see that a wedge-shaped area has been excavated. And like I said, I'm going to just talk you briefly through the sort of the different features, and then we're going to focus in on some of the burials. Okay, so in the earliest phases of the site, so about 350 to 600, we're sort of in the late Iron Age, early medieval period. And what the site seems to have started off as is a multi-phase circular enclosure. So you've got enclosures A and then enclosures B. And inside these enclosures, there seems to have been quite a small self-sufficient production centre. And the types of things they were finding, were granaries. So there was lots of evidence for cereal grain production. And they found, lots of barley with smaller quantities of oats, wheat and rye. So it looks like the neighbouring farms, so people living out in the neighbouring rafts, were bringing their grains into this site to be processed, to be, dried and processed. There was also then lots of evidence for kilns. And again, the environmental archaeologists were able to sort of look at the different types of wood they were using, and they found lots of remains of charcoal, with oak, ash, hazel, and a whole range of different woods being used. And these seem to have then, the charcoal seems to have been used for metalworking. In terms of the animals, there was lots of cattle, sheep, goat, and it looks like you've got animals of all different ages. So they were being sort of reared on the site and butchered on the site. And it seems then that the settlement cemetery seems to have kind of evolved into an administrative centre. And we know that there's about 17 different ring forts within 2 kilometres of the site. So maybe all of these people were, making use of the site. Around the 6th century then, the initial enclosure was remodelled and a new enclosing ditch was dug. And this included this droveway, which you can see here. And again, this gives us an indication that there's a lot of animal management going on, and that butchery and animal rearing were important for the people. Now, in terms of the burials during this phase, we seem to have quite a small sort of burial ground, and it looks like it was probably a familial plot. So you've got a very industrious settlement, and then the people who used that settlement and who lived there were actually being buried in it. So there were only about 37 individuals in this kind of cluster, and a few scattered down here during the earliest phases of the site. So then about a century or so after, you've got sort of the site being very much remodelled, and all of the earlier banks and ditches were sort of dismantled, and a new larger enclosure, which you can see in green, this is enclosure C, it was constructed. So this seems to be a much more substantial and possibly even defensive set of banks and ditches. And it's thought that maybe it's giving us an indication that the wealth and status of the site's inhabitants had increased. And it's now that we're maybe starting to think about, centralisation of a local authority. So in terms of economy, it seems that we're still lots of cereal drying, animal processing and other agricultural activities going on. There were even evidence for things like malting of grains for beer, but it also seemed to develop into a centre for craft production. So there was lots of evidence for textile, leather, antler and bone production. And even small scale working, or metalworking, so mostly iron, but there was some evidence for copper. And these seem to be taking place, near 2 roundhouses and then also on a sort of cobbled surface. There were also 2 souterrains discovered. And just from the sort of artefacts recovered from these, they think that one might have been used for small scale metalworking, while the other might have been used to store dairy products. Now, I focus very much on the burials, but if you read the book, you'll see there's chapters devoted to all of the different artefacts that were recovered from the site. And there was a whole range of different objects relating to dress and personal adornment, and lots of, domestic tools that a farming community would have needed. So it's a very exciting assemblage. Now, this era was when the cemetery was greatly enlarged, and it was no longer just used for family. And it seems, as you can see from the number of burials, that the wider community started to be buried in the site at this time. Now, one of the interesting things about Ranelagh, just in terms of its burial distribution, there's almost 2 women to every man that are buried here. And it's thought maybe that men were sort of the ones who maybe took up the sort of new burial practices a bit earlier than women. So by the early 8th century, it would have been more appropriate for Christians to be buried in consecrated ground. And we know that there were a number of medieval churches and quite prominent medieval foundations, less than 2 kilometres away. So we wonder where the men being buried there and the women opted to sort of continue with the sort of more traditional burial practices at Ranelagh, because as you'll see, it's mostly women and children that we find in the later phases. So around AD 1000, Ranelagh was very much more quiet, and now it was really just an enclosed burial ground, and a burial ground that was slowly going out of use. And the main sort of activity at this time was the construction of enclosure D, which you can see here. And here there was only about 24 burials from this time period, and most of these were again women and children. So like I say, it looks like they either were not allowed to move into the consecrated ground, or for whatever reason they wanted to sort of continue with their ancestral burial grounds. And then sort of if we move into the medieval period proper, At this time, all of the enclosing ditches had been backfilled, and it seems there was a mixture of kind of natural silting and subsidence and dumping. So there was a combination of neglect and then sort of deliberate destruction. There was still a wee bit of activity at the site. So, for example, in the 1150 to 1410 phase, a keyhole-shaped kiln was constructed. So again, there was some grain processing going on at the site. And at this time, we know that the O'Connors would have been the controlling families in the area, and they probably lived quite close to Ranelagh, because we know that one of their big sites, Rathbrennan, is only a few miles away. We know that this was a period of great kind of socio-political change, and there was a lot of change going on in the landscape surrounding Ranelagh. So there was a lot of sort of consolidation and infighting with local families. And then we also have the Anglo-Norman conquest of Connacht by the de Burgos. So this resulted then in the development of Roscommon town and the construction of its castle. And there was a lot of sacking went on of the surrounding countryside. So, you know, we don't really know what exactly the impact was on Ranelagh, but it's bound to have had some sort of impact. And during this phase, there was only 22 burials. And again, it was 2 older women, and then the rest were children. Oops. So this is just the very final, oh gosh, sorry about that. The very final phase is AD 1410 up until 1800. And basically all that happened at this time were 2 little burials of babies. And it's thought that this might have been, you know, a hint of a clean phase, so maybe a burial ground for unbaptized babies at this time. And there was also a new field boundary put in. And then basically after this time, the site at Ranelagh seems to have been forgotten. And it was just basically a field used for ordinary grazing. Now, one possible reason this may have happened is that maybe it was obliterated as part of landscaping works by Richard Jones, and he was the first Earl of Ranelagh. And we know that in 1708, he had endowed a grant for the construction of a charity school in both Roscommon and Athlone. And the land that he was planning to use in Roscommon included the site at Ranelagh, included the site where it's, or the fields where it was located. Now, there was a delay until about 1760, and this followed an Act of Parliament for the education of poor Protestant children. But it's very likely that at this time, if there had been any upstanding remains of the settlement cemetery at Ranelagh, that they would have been sort of obliterated and sort of the land would have been flattened. And that's the way it seems to have stayed until it was recovered by or rediscovered by the archaeologists. So that's a very quick run through just what happened at the site. Just to kind of refresh your memory. When we're talking about the settlement cemetery, we're talking about this little kind of wedge shape here. So you've got the burial starting up here and then going all the way through here. And this is our enclosure D. So we do have phases for the burials, but in the osteoarchaeological analysis, we treated them all as one homogeneous group because we wanted to get better sort of statistically viable results. So we do have the information by phase, but in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, it's a bit more general. So in terms of, you know, the scientific analysis of skeletons, why do we do this? So basically we want to try to move from a skeleton to living people. So we want to put flesh back onto the bones of these people. We want to look at things like their health, their diet, their lifestyle, evidence of violence, evidence of emotion, their religion, population movement, and things like the evolution of infectious disease. So we can get a huge amount of information by looking at each individual and then by looking at the overall population. Now, we don't do this lightly. So somebody just before I came in here asked me, why this cemetery? Well, this cemetery was the one that was being excavated as part of a grand road scheme. And basically most of the burials that I've studied through my career have been to do with development. And archaeologists, we only disturb the dead when there's a very good reason to do so. And it's usually in advance of development. And it's usually when there's been a lot of sort of meetings, a lot of discussions, and the needs of the living are considered to outweigh those of the dead. So there's a very highly regulated system with different licenses, for export of remains from the south to the north, and with licenses for any sort of destructive analysis that we might do, like radiocarbon dating. And we tend to maybe use like a little gram of bone for a lot of our scientific techniques. I think it's very important to give a voice to the people of the past and tell their stories, because the history books tend to be filled with the stories of the great and the good. Whereas when we look at cemeteries like Ranelagh, we're looking at the ordinary people, and I think their stories deserve to be told as well. And that's what osteoarchaeologists can do. I also think, you know, archaeology and bioarchaeology really can help us to understand the present and also prepare from the future. So we have to learn from the past. And, you know, some of the obvious things that we can contribute to are, you know, knowledge of diseases and their evolution. And now, you know, with climate change being such an emergency, such a crisis, we can look at how people in the past reacted to different scenarios and to changing temperatures, changing wetness, and we can help planners to predict, you know, what might be coming our way. You know, and I think there was some discussion about malaria and mosquitoes on the news this morning. You know, and Britain potentially being, you know, a viable place for mosquitoes to live again in the future, and potentially then we you know, people living there will be at risk of malaria. So, you know, all these sorts of things we can feed into. I suppose the work I do, I think of it as social bioarchaeology. So we're peopling the past. And like I said, everybody's got a tale to tell. And we know modern cultures are really diverse. And that's what we also find in cemeteries like Ranelagh. So I hope I'll be sort of able to introduce, you know, all of these different categories of people in my talk tonight. Now, I'll be doing it very quickly, but basically, they're all there, all these diverse range of people. Okay, so like I said, I mean, I'm an osteoarchaeologist principally, and I focus then on the skeletal side and the burial side at Ranelagh. So we basically won a competitive tender to undertake the analysis of this population, and we worked with Martin Jones of Transport Infrastructure Ireland. So we had the Ranelagh Osteoarchaeology Project running in Queen's from September 2017 to April 2019. So it was an all-female team, not by any particular desire of mine. That was we couldn't get any male osteoarchaeologists to apply. It's a very female-dominated area of archaeology. So that was the team, and we spent a considerable amount of time, you know, washing the bones, then undertaking their analysis. So during this time period, and the end result was a substantial report, which is freely available up on the Royal Irish Academy's digital repository. So with all the kind of the background information. So then there was phase 2 of the project. So again, this was TII, Queen's and IAC. So between spring 2021 and spring 2022, we worked on the book. So it was Shane Delaney, myself, and Martin Jones. And as Anne says, you know, we've got our open access version up online. We've also then got sort of an audio version, and there's also a story map for people to kind of just dip in and see some of the highlights. So the work hasn't finished, and these big projects never really does. And like a lot of what I'm hoping to do now is to focus on specialist articles. Ranelagh has also spun off into 3 different PhD projects at Queen's, and there's more planned. So it was a really nice example of how university, government, and commercial archaeologists could come together, you know, on a big project and, you know, get a huge amount of information. So at Ranelagh as well, you know, it wasn't just the osteoarchaeological analysis, and there was a lot of other scientific techniques were used, and you'll hear about these, you know, throughout my presentation. So here in Queen's and Chrono, we got a huge number of radiocarbon dates for the site. So it was about 200 altogether. So that enabled us to get a really detailed site chronology, and I think it's probably the most detailed you know, the site with the greatest number of radiocarbon dates for a cemetery so far in Ireland. And you really do need that to be able to understand, you know, how the cemetery develops. We were also then able to get carbon and nitrogen isotopes to try to reconstruct diet. Strontium and oxygen isotopes were undertaken by Janet Montgomery in Durham, and this enables us to see if we've got any non-local people in the population. Janet Montgomery did dentine incremental analysis of isotopes, and this can help us chart, you know, physiological stress in children from even before birth, while their teeth are developing. Dr. Lara Cassidy in Trinity College Dublin undertook some ancient DNA, and we were interested in things like trying to find family groups, just even knowing, what colour a person was in terms of pigmentation and their eye colour and hair colour, because again, that really helps us to relate to these people and not just view them as skeletons, but to imagine what they might have looked like. The DNA also gives some insights into disease and then migration. And we also tried some archaeothanatology on some of the burials. So this is basically you take a very detailed analysis of a burial, and you have to understand how the body decomposes, and it helps us to understand burials that maybe have unusual positioning, and we have to look at the sort of sequencing of decomposition and work out whether there was maybe other organic remains in the grave that have decomposed before the skeleton and then caused sort of strange spaces and different things. So we did all these different things. So I'm going to just now start, and we're going to look at some burial practices, and then we'll look a bit more at health and violence and different aspects of the population. So, as you might expect, most of the people at Ranelagh were laid to rest in a sort of Christian burial tradition. So, as you can see from this individual over to the left, so they would have been buried in single interments in shallow earthen graves. Typically, the head was pointed towards the west, and then the body was in an extended supine position, so basically lying with straight arms and legs on their backs. Now, we know from the sort of gospel descriptions of Jesus's body being wrapped in linen prior to burial, that it's probable that many of the individuals buried in this position had been shrouded or had been, wrapped in some sort of a winding sheet prior to being put into the earthen graves. Now, atypical burials at Ranelagh, they were relatively uncommon, but those that were present were incredibly interesting. And sometimes people see atypical burial as something that's negative, but whenever you find them within a communal cemetery, I don't really think that's necessarily appropriate, and it's just something different. And the differences are often quite subtle, and I think a lot of times these burials would have been made by family members. They didn't necessarily have to have had a priest present, because there mightn't have been a priest available. So I think in a lot of these atypical burials, we've got families trying to personalize a grave and either imbue it with, emotions or maybe some sort of enhanced religious meaning. So as I've seen in other Irish burial grounds, a lot of the children in atypical burial positions, they seem to have been put, in a less formal way, so in a more sort of restful sort of repose, as if they were sleeping, so kind of, lying on their sides and, just their little arms. They're not kind of put into the sort of the rigid position that adults would have been. There were a number of interesting prone burials. So prone, as you can see here, means buried face down. Now, the traditional sort of interpretation of a prone burial is that, there was something negative about them and that they didn't want the person rising up from their grave, so they buried them face down. But again, I think whenever you've got a prone burial in a sort of communal family or communal community sort of cemetery that's Christian, it doesn't, that interpretation doesn't quite work. So what I think is possible is that we're dealing with penitence, and this has been suggested elsewhere as well. Now, whenever the prone burials were lifted, you can see their arm position. So their arms were basically up in front of their chest, or they had one arm up in front of their chest. So this seems to be, either the kind of the beating of the breast sort of prayer position, or what's called the orans prayer position. And I think what they were trying to do was to actually reflect the prostate prayer position. So it's again maybe tied into kind of penance, because we know that St. Basil called this prostate prayer position the greater penance. And writing in the 4th century, St. Augustine said, "They who pray even prostrate themselves on the ground." So, and we know that this type of burial position or prayer position, would have been something, because it's in the historical sources, that the people at Ranelagh might have used. So that was one kind of atypical burial practice that I thought was pretty interesting. There's a whole range more, but I don't have time to go into them, unfortunately. There was a lot of grave goods at Ranelagh, and this is quite unusual. Betty O'Brien did a review of about 11,000 early medieval burials from 156 sites in Ireland, and she found that only about 1% included grave goods, but at Ranelagh we had about 39%. Now, admittedly, most of them were quartz pebbles, so there was about 23% were little quartz pebbles. And this seems to be, you know, a tradition of very great longevity. And basically, you know, you get lots of burial grounds where you do have sort of white stones associated with them, you know, even from the prehistoric times. Even modern cemeteries, people still put, you know, shiny stones on burials and on graves. And it does seem to be that the white stones are associated with water and regeneration in early Christian texts, and possibly represent baptism and resurrection. So you can see here, this little infant has a large quartz pebble, and sometimes they would have had, you know, one quartz pebble or lots of quartz dotted around the body. There was also then just examples of maybe dress. So this little girl, she was only a little 3.5 to 4.5 year old. You can see she's got a little bone pin that maybe held something together. And then this is an older child here, and you can see they've got an iron blade. So there it is. So there was a whole range of different types of things, and some burials seem to have, you know, definite animal sort of carcasses put in with them. I think one child had a dog, and another one had, I think it was maybe it was a bird, possibly a raven. So there was lots of interesting things going on in terms of grave goods. I'm just going to talk, these two individuals were particularly interesting, so I just want to talk a little bit about them. So this is skeleton 176 over to the left, and he was an older adult male, and he had what's called a toe ring, because basically it's a ring on his toe. So there you can see the toe ring in situ, and that's what it looked like. Now you can see his clavicles are very vertical, so that suggests that he'd been shrouded, like his body was quite compressed together. And there was also quartz pebbles recovered from his grave. So the toe ring made him really interesting, and a lot of the different techniques then were applied to him. So the strontium and oxygen isotope analysis, it revealed that he was local to the Ranelagh area. The DNA analysis revealed that he had brown eyes, light brown hair, and very pale skin. And also it revealed that he was related to about 6 of the other individuals from the same sort of time period as him. So this is just the people whose DNA was analysed. So he could have been related to a lot more, but we know he was certainly related to 6. Now, the toe ring was, as I said, very exciting because it suggested that he was wearing a single sandal when he was buried. And this is an indicator of high social status potentially. Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, she has looked at monosandalism, as it's called, and she said it's an attribute of heroes, or basically people of special status from the sort of mythological world. So mythological heroes, supernatural visitors to the mortal world, kingship claimants, warriors, sorcerers, and saints. So it's basically considered to be, you know, a recognized sort of status symbol throughout the medieval era. And you know, in sort of inauguration rites from the later 15th and 16th century, the Gaelic royal inauguration rites would have included monosandalism. And we've got Irish medieval poems that use the term fair on Ennis, which is the man with one sandal. And they're referring in these to a claim on a high status position or an inaugurated member of the elite within society. So there was lots of indicators to sort of suggest this might have been you know, one of the rulers of the group, somebody high status. This is another one I just picked to show you. So this is skeleton 420. And this was an adolescent female. So she was shown through DNA to be female. And you can see she's got a large piece of antler beam, and it had lots of different saw marks on her, and they were put on her pelvis. So again, strontium and oxygen isotopes suggested that she was local to Ranelagh. And you can see, I mean, it looks quite phallic, and it does seem that antler being included in burials probably is a symbol of kind of reproduction and fertility. And Maeve Tobin and Jenny Coughlin have published an article on this because there are parallels from other medieval burial grounds where you've got young females being buried, you know, with antler. So again, that was quite unusual, and it just shows you, you know, we can look at something but it's without sort of historical sources, it can be very difficult to really make sense, you know, of what we're finding. So at Ranelagh, we also had a number of very special burials, double burials, and I found these particularly poignant. So I'm going to talk about two of them. So this is the first one. So we've got skeleton 55 and skeleton 54. So skeleton 55 was a little boy. So again, we had DNA analysis undertaken on these individuals. So he was only about 2.5 to 3 years old. And then skeleton 54 was a girl. So she was a little girl, but she was a bit older than him at 7.5 to 9.5 years. And again, you know, this is a lovely watercolour produced by Libby Mulqueeny, and it was based on the DNA work. So we know that the little boy had blue eyes and light brown hair. The little girl had brown eyes and light brown hair, and they were both fairly pale in pigmentation. So what was interesting was that the DNA also showed that these children were probably first cousins once removed, but they don't seem to have been related to any of the other individuals in the Ranelagh DNA dataset. The little boy's DNA was quite similar to the modern Irish in that area, but the little girl, her DNA was a bit different, and the suggestion was that she maybe had one Irish and one British parent. But you can see that they're buried very close together. The little girl's head is sort of touching the little boy's. And what's really poignant is that the little girl's arm actually, here it is, you can see her head has been removed here. Her arm's going right behind the little boy's neck and then coming out on his shoulder. So it's very much a hugging position. And you get a sense that whoever buried these children, you know, the two families, they must have been very close. There must have been very close connections in life. And I think you can almost interpret it as, you know, it is a hugging position. And maybe the little girl had been charged with looking after the little boy in the afterlife. So this is what I mean about looking at burials and being able to find evidence of positive emotion, you know, and here I think, you know, it is a very poignant burial and there's a lot going on, and there was a lot going on in the minds of the living who, you know, arranged these children in this way. And I think it tells us of great loss and great sorrow. So the next double burial I want to talk about, this is slightly different. So this time we have skeleton 63, who was a young adult male over here. And then skeleton 64, who was a teenage male. So he's here. Again, you can see we're dealing with a very intimate position. You can see that they've got their arms wrapped around each other's waist. And then the younger man has his hand on the back of the older one's head. And then you can see again that the other hand is actually resting right on top of the head. So it's a very kind of entwined, very intimate position. Now, in terms of DNA, it revealed that they were probably quite closely related, probably first cousins. So you have to then ask yourself, you know, did these guys have a very close relationship in life? You know, were they foster brothers or were they lovers? You know, again, we don't know. We have to be open-minded to the relationships that we can identify in the past. And we do find we've got a number of different pairings of men in double burials across Ireland. Now, quite often they would have weapon injuries, but you do get examples like these pair who don't have any injuries. And you've got examples of maybe, I think there was 2 decapitated men from Knox Park in Sligo, and they were holding hands, you know, so maybe they're just kind of entwined in a way so that they could look after each other again in the afterlife. But we know from the Irish sagas and annals that there could be a very close relationship between foster brothers, and they're quite often described as foster brother of the same blanket and of the same cup and of the same bed. So maybe this is the case as well for cousins. But like I say, the fact that there's so much intertwining going on and the touching of the hair, you know, it is very sort of sensual and romantic, and there very may well have been a sexual element to their relationship. So I just want to touch briefly on the DNA. So Lara would have plotted the individuals from Ranelagh against modern sort of DNA profiles. So you can see the pink are females and the blue are males. And you can see that the greatest clusters from Ranelagh tend to sort of locate on Irish modern populations. So sort of where you'd expect, you know, sort of central Leinster, South Leinster, and then also a bit of southern Scotland. So you get a sense that there's continuity between the people buried at Ranelagh and the modern Irish population. Now, there were some outliers. So the most notable is this individual here, this woman, skeleton 488, and I'll talk about her next. And she seems to, she's got a signature that's much more similar to somebody from modern Europe. You've also got people who are more on the sort of the British scale, so closer to those from Scotland and Wales. And then you've got a few people who were maybe from different parts of Ireland. So it's just something DNA has really opened up to us, the fact that we can't think of people in these cemeteries as a homogeneous mass. There were people moved about. Being an island wouldn't have been a block because people used boats and they were very skilled mariners. So we can't just sort of make assumptions about the sort of the race and kind of the place of origin of people in these cemeteries. So that's why it's really exciting being able to investigate these. In terms of disease, some of the things that Lara found, all except skeleton 255 were lactose tolerant. Skeleton 255 was a woman, and I just imagined her life must have been really miserable because she had been living, in a dairying economy and probably not understood at all why she was feeling sick all the time. And, it must have been very difficult. A number of individuals were also carriers of hemochromatosis, which is, it's known as the Celtic disease, and when you've got an overload of iron. And this condition, like we've also shown through DNA that it was present in Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin. So it's something we kind of expect to find in medieval populations. So it was there. The DNA specialists, they're always on the lookout for evidence of cystic fibrosis, because that's, again, a big disease that modern Irish people suffer from, but so far it hasn't turned up in any of the populations that I've been involved with. So I want to just talk about skeleton 488. So this is her burial, and then again, this is a reconstruction drawing that Libby did, and again, it's based on DNA evidence for her sort of skin tone and her hair colouring. And a colleague of mine in Finland too, she did some microfiber analysis just on the off chance to see if it would work, because this is a technique they're increasingly using, on prehistoric populations. So we had some soil samples from Ranelagh, and she just looked at a few, and she was able to find blue fibers, like from blue woolen fibers. So we sort of then tried to bring that into our reconstruction drawing, and maybe the woman was wrapped in some sort of a blue blanket. But it's something I would really like to do on more Irish burials, because I think, again, it can really sort of, enhance our understanding of these people if we understand what was put into the burials, but maybe is now invisible through typical archaeological techniques. So she was an older female. Like I say, she had sort of red hair, pale skin, and brown eyes. She was associated with a number of grave goods, so a copper alloy terminal, some work bone, and quartz. She wasn't in great shape because she was pretty elderly. She'd lost a lot of her teeth during life. Her skull was quite an unusual shape, but it was very broken up, so it was tricky for us to work out what was going on. She had chronic maxillary sinusitis, and she had osteoarthritis all throughout her body, so her spine, and then also the joints of her long bones. And the DNA suggested that she had sort of like this sort of Northern British ancestry, but that might hark back to sort of maybe kind of Saxon, or maybe further back in time. And there were other hints at her different place of origin. So this graph here shows her dentine sort of incremental carbon. And you can see her line was here. So she was different to everybody else. And it suggested that her childhood diet had a lot more fish than everybody else who had the study done on them from Ranelagh. All of the individuals, Janet Montgomery looked at their lead levels, and most people had grown up in a very unpolluted environment except her. So she had the highest lead levels of all. So it looks like she maybe had a non-rural childhood, and maybe she was exposed to sort of industrial and metal smelting during childhood, and that's how the lead then got into her system. And the combination of her strontium and oxygen isotopes, the closest parallels have been found in early medieval burials in Coppergate, York, and Masham in Yorkshire. So it looks like, this is potentially, she maybe came from England, but her genetics are kind of harking back to the kind of Saxons. So she was a really interesting case study, and just sort of shows what you can find when all of these different techniques are pulled together. Okay, so moving on then to look at the population themselves. So we had 557 individuals. Now, the sort of breakdown was quite interesting because you can see it's pretty much a third each. So 191 babies, so less than a year, 196 children, so less than 18, so between 1 and 18, and then the rest were adults. So, I mean, today, this level of infant and child mortality would just be catastrophic, but for pre-industrial populations, it's not terribly unusual. And we had, as I'll show you, a couple of unborn babies all the way through to older adults. So we had 2 pregnant women and their unborn babies. So this one here, skeleton 112 and skeleton 119. So skeleton, the mother was basically a young adult female, and she was quite petite. She was about 5'2". She had a male baby because we were able to again look at his DNA. And he was 38 weeks gestation and his head was positioned down. So he was probably nearly ready to be born. And again, we did some DNA work on this pair, and it was quite interesting because the mother's DNA showed that she had no other relatives in the DNA data set, whereas the baby had 3 relatives. So it looks like the mother was an outsider, somebody who'd been brought into the population. She'd married somebody from the area, and then the baby carried his father and his mother's genetic signatures. So that was quite interesting. The other individual was maybe even more interesting. So she was, again, a very young adult. So some of her bones weren't fused. So she was probably between 17 and 22 years. Again, the baby was near term and was basically lying with the head down, so ready to be born. She was again very petite. She was only about 4'11". So maybe the small stature, the petite nature of these 2 women might have meant that it was difficult when the time came to give birth. Now, in a lot of sort of modern developing countries, the types of reasons women die pregnant, can range from things like hemorrhage, hypertensive disorders and eclampsia, infection, obstructed labour, and then unsafe abortions, which are unlikely at this stage. But I want to talk a little bit more about this pair. So, skeleton 263, as she's called, she was buried in a very unusual place within the cemetery. She was buried in the ditch. So this was a grave that had been cut into the base of the enclosure D ditch. And the nature of the grave, it suggests that maybe enclosure D was still open and it was still being used when the pair were buried. And if you look at the woman, you can see her limbs are quite slightly akimbo. You can see her rib cages, the ribs are all very splayed, and there's kind of sort of gaps in her vertebrae. So this all tells us that she probably decomposed in sort of partially open space and uneven ground. So it doesn't look like she had been fully covered over with earth. And it looks like, the ground underneath was very rough. So that's why you get these gaps in her vertebrae. You can see she's got no head and it's in quite a sloped area. So it's possibly just that her head had rolled away. And you can see just that the arms kind of splayed out from the body. And, her pelvis is quite open. So this all just looks like it's not a formal burial. So we get the sense that it's a sort of a rushed, undignified burial compared to what was happening with other people. Now, it's quite interesting that we've got quite a close parallel from another site, Ballykilmore 1 in County Westmeath. So you can see, again, we've got a pregnant woman being buried in a ditch. Now, she's not buried longitudinal the way the other one was from Ranelagh. She's sort of buried at right angles to the longitudinal axis. Now, she had a number of interesting features. So you can see she's got a stone in her mouth. You can see her arms are even more askew than the individual from Ranelagh. And you can see her ribs are very open as well. So again, it looks like a very similar situation in that she's decomposed in a sort of an open environment. The stone in her mouth suggests that there was something negative being shown towards her. And I think these burials are potentially what we'd call deviant burials. We've got other burials in Ireland with stones in their mouths from Coolteige. And generally this is where there's a notion that there's some sort of a fear that these individuals can come back, rise from their graves and harm the living. So they want to disable them by putting stones in their mouth. Now this individual, she also had a very elongated skull. So she had a condition called scaphocephaly. And this can be associated, with sort of kind of developmental delay and learning disability related to speech and language. So maybe that was one of the reasons why she was treated differently, but there was no obvious sign of any kind of physical disabilities in the woman from Ranelagh. Although we do have to remember that a lot of conditions are invisible to us as archaeologists. So whatever seems to have happened, these two young women at both sites, they do seem to have been outcasts in their community for some unknown reason. So maybe they were perceived to have done something wrong. There'd been some sort of social misdemeanor. Maybe there were mental health issues, or maybe they simply had got pregnant with the wrong person and there was a serious issue with the paternity of their babies. So those are pretty tragic, but interesting cases. So in terms of the very young babies at Ranelagh, so we've seen the still in utero babies. We also had two sets of twins, and they were both little newborns. There were then 12 preterm infants, and they'd all died during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So this would be, again, quite a common sort of paleodemographic pattern. And again, this is the time where maternal conditions like placenta previa, which causes a low-lying placenta, can cause a lot of profuse bleeding and death. The youngest of these preterm babies had died about 29 gestational weeks, was about seven months. And then we also had 34 full-term neonatal babies. The fact that they were buried separate from adults maybe does suggest that the mothers survived the births, or that they didn't die at the same time, and maybe the mother had survived for a little bit longer and they ended up getting buried separately. Now, I just want to show you this example. So this is one set of twins which were very well preserved. So you have little 453 on one side and 455 on the other. There's lots of cranial bones, these flat bones, just lying across the bodies. But you can see the babies positioned, they're basically shoulder to shoulder, and they both have this quite unusual cross-legged position. So, the dating suggests they were twins, and the kind of mirroring of the two bodies also suggests they were twins. But what was really poignant was their little hands. So these are the hands in the middle here. And you can see they're either positioned right beside each other, or they were actually overlapped or entwined. So again, I think, we're seeing evidence of grief and loss in this burial, and that they'd been laid out, in a way that the families kind of wanted the pair to be sort of together in the afterlife. So it was quite a hard little burial to sort of interpret, but I think that's maybe what was going on. So just in terms of the juvenile demography, so this is the under 18s, you can see, so these are the ones I've just talked about, the very youngest babies, but you can see we've got a large spike between 1 month and 1 year. And I thought this was quite interesting, and I think I kind of understand what was happening, and I think it's all tied into sort of vitamin deficiencies and sort of infant feeding practices and maternal malnutrition, because life would have been very hard for these people. So just to show you a few examples of sort of the vitamin deficiencies I'm talking about. So this little child here, this little baby, 7.5 months old, they had a whole range of lesions all over their body, which seemed to be indicative of scurvy. So lots of fine grey new bone formation across different parts of the skull, thickening at the sides of their eye sockets, and then all this kind of layers of new bone on the roofs of their eye sockets. Scurvy tends to occur because of vitamin C deficiency. And these are the lesions that are quite classic now for the identification of scurvy in very young children. And it's basically because there's lots of bleeding, as the child moves. So you get this new bone formation indicative of bleeding, at anywhere that there's movement. And it would have been a really horrible condition for the parents to deal with, because the babies would be in a lot of pain, they would be irritable, their limbs would have been very tender, and they would have avoided sort of moving because of all this sort of pain going on where they were bleeding. So really nasty. And you can see that, again, there's little bits of quartz in this grave. So there were 7 pieces all together. So somebody, cared for this little baby and put them into their grave, carefully. Vitamin D deficiency then was the other one of these sort of micronutrient deficiencies that was evident. So this case is little 341, again, 7.5 months, and we seem to have rickets in the process of healing. So again, you get kind of new bone formation, but it's very coarse, it's very coral-like on the outside of the skull bones. You get sort of porosity around the sides of the eye sockets. You get lots of erosion of the bones, and all of the little long bones tend to be frayed at their ends. And you get little flattening of the metaphyses, so again, sort of the ends of the bones. So vitamin D deficiency, it seems to be more associated with sort of dark environmental conditions. So, you know, if basically the babies aren't getting enough sunlight, they're very prone to getting rickets. So what you get is sort of poor mineralization of the bone and sort of restricted growth. You get lots of porosity. You get these kind of biomechanical deformations of the bones, and again, a very nasty condition. But again, you can see there's quartz between the legs of the baby and then at the top and over at the side. So again, a burial with care. Now, it is a bit of a nightmare to differentiate in these young children between vitamin C and vitamin D deficiency. And a lot of times you do get comorbidity, you get both conditions. And I did find a lot of cases that tentatively we've identified as comorbidity, although we do need to do a bit more work on this. So I just wanted to show you the kind of the age profile. So we had about 38.7% of babies seem to have had this evidence of malnutrition, so evidence of rickets and or scurvy. Now, if you look, this is why I basically think a lot of the under ones were dying, it's because they were suffering from these vitamin deficiencies. So you can see the grey is scurvy and rickets, and you can see it really peaks, sort of goes up and peaks about 9 months. All of the conditions, scurvy and rickets, they all seem to kind of end around this sort of 9 months, and then you've got a big drop, and gradually as they get older, there's very little. And I think there was only one adult that seemed to have had, you know, active vitamin deficiency, as opposed to, you know, just evidence from having survived from their childhood. So I think it was something to do with maternal nourishment and also what they were doing to feed the babies. So we've got quite a lot of babies under 6 months with evidence of these deficiencies. So that tells us that the mothers were malnourished, because, you know, a baby's best chance of survival would have been able to successfully breastfeed. So if the mother is very malnourished, maybe she wasn't producing enough breast milk to feed their baby. If there was no wet nurses available, they may have had to then resort to using substitute foodstuffs. So maybe, you know, animal milk, which wouldn't have contained enough vitamin C for a human baby. Now, we don't really know what sort of alternative foods were being given to babies in medieval Ireland if breast milk wasn't available. But, you know, the early medieval historical sources, they do indicate that milk products were a big component of the general diet. And we know that they would have drunk milk in its natural form, or they would have, you know, done lots of sort of alterations to it and diluted it with water or boiled it. And if they did that and then fed it to the baby, that would have meant that it would have further depleted its vitamin C content. Now, when Julia did her work on the isotopes, she suggested that sort of full, you know, sole breastfeeding had ended about 6 months. And then they started to introduce other substances to the diet. And I think what we're seeing here in terms of the drop of these deficiencies after about 9 months maybe is an indicator that they were introducing a variety of different foodstuffs, you know, maybe including fruit and vegetables, and that this then was responsible for, you know, reducing the levels of scurvy. We also know that, you know, everybody would have eaten porridge. And again, you know, maybe children, maybe the babies were being given porridge when they got to this type of age. You know, and there's a whole sort of sects in the law tracts about porridge being given to people of different status. So why would the mothers have been malnourished? You know, maybe it was a case of natural disasters, you know, an animal disease, crop disease, or environmental events. And we know from the annals, you know, that again, you know, there were these disasters, you know, and extreme weather events that maybe would have put people at serious risk of malnourishment. So, for example, in the Annals of Ulster in AD 764, there was a year of excessive snowfall, drought and famine, and it's then said that dysentery flourished, presumably because people were so malnourished, and that the young, old and the weak were particularly vulnerable. So I think, you know, in these populations, it probably would have been, you know, the pregnant women, the breastfeeding mothers and their babies who would have been most negatively impacted. And also, in terms of rickets, it's probable that these are the individuals who would have been sheltering indoors, you know, if there were these frequent periods of inclement weather. And you can imagine that to try and protect the babies during the colder months, they'd have been wrapped up in bundles of clothing, kept in these dark, smoky conditions. And that probably then meant that they didn't get any exposure to sunlight and exacerbated, you know, their sort of the vitamin D deficiency. So life was very grim for the babies, but if you survived young babyhood, you tended to make it through to adolescence. And in terms of the adults, a lot of adults made it through to middle age, which is really interesting because at another population I've looked at, Ballyhanna, most of the adults were dying very young as young adults. So this suggests that, you know, the adults in some senses, maybe not considering our pregnant women or whatever, but if they were sort of survivors, they could make it through to middle age. So you can see the different age groups are fairly well represented, but we've got a good chunk of sort of middle-aged and a good chunk of older adults. But there's other indicators in the population that just, again, reveal evidence about an arduous physical life, which is what we'd have expected because medieval people would have had to be very physically active. You know, they'd have spent a lot of their time, you know, trying to get water, trying to get food. They'd have had to tend their crops. You know, livestock would have been raised to produce meat, milk, skins, and a whole range of things. They'd have had to make all their own houses. They'd have had to make all their own clothes. And, you know, we saw all the evidence for industrial activities, you know, at the site. So these people would have been very busy, and everybody from young children all the way through would have had a role to play. And, you know, we can look at things like osteoarthritis and evidence of accidental injuries to help us understand, you know, the sorts of activities people were engaging in. So there were quite a lot of cases of osteoarthritis in the hands and feet. So you can see this sort of polishing. There was lots of spinal osteoarthritis, and these are Schmorl's nodes. So basically, they would form quite early on in life and are just again an indicator of sort of an arduous physical existence. So basically, they would have been undertaking back-breaking work, which would have put a lot of stress and strain on their joints. And this then followed through into evidence for injuries. So there was about 22% displayed these accidental injuries. And again, it's sort of typical of a farming lifestyle. You mightn't be able to read this, but the females are orange and males are blue. And it was quite interesting because we do seem to be picking up gendered patterns of injury. And again, the Irish historical texts, they talk about the gendered division of labour. So this is what we would expect. So don't have much time to talk about all that, but I just want to talk about this man here. So he was an individual who showed a more serious injury. He had a hip fracture, fracture of his left hip, and then also a fracture of his left lower leg. So you can see that his femoral head, instead of being nice and round, it's kind of broken in half. And he seems to have had a high impact injury, which basically caused his femoral head to split. So it looks like there was some sort of direct force had happened to his hip. And then the bit that's missing from the ball actually fused to the hip joint itself. And you can even see his left leg is slightly raised in the grave. And this is probably just because of the sort of the deformity caused by his fracture. Now, excuse me. So there's a lot of porosity and polishing and things going on as well. So that suggests that he did survive his injury and he went on to live for quite a long period of time. Now, one of my students, Jess White, she's actually looking at, how this individual would have moved about, and she's looking at the care that might have been afforded to him, because you could imagine, he would have been immobile for quite a long period of time. So, he would have relied on the care of others, presumably his family, for survival. So they'd have had to attend to things like his feeding, his hygiene, also giving him pain relief, also, making sure that if there were any sort of wounds, that these didn't get infected. So he probably was immobile for quite a long period of time. But as I said, The evidence for this osteoarthritis suggests that he did eventually retain movement, but he probably was quite unstable. And this is what Jess has been looking at and try to reconstruct, what sort of walking aids he might have needed. So infection is something we always find in medieval populations as well. And Ranelagh wasn't any different. So there was lots of sort of what we call non-specific infections, so caused by a whole range of kind of the bacteria that live in the earth, but that we can't identify from their lesions. The only specific infective disease, so a disease that we can identify in the Ranelagh population, was tuberculosis. And this can be a chronic disease, so people can live with it for a long period of time. It can be spread from human to human, or it can be spread from animals to human. We've had some pathogen DNA work undertaken on some of the individuals by Professor Mike Taylor in the University of Surrey, and he's been able to identify that it's actually the human-to-human form of the disease that these people were suffering from. So we had 10 individuals from Ranelagh had tuberculosis. So this shows that the prevalence was about 2.7%, which seems very low, but that's probably only the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the other cases were probably invisible. And if we look at comparator sites in Ireland, the prevalence is only about 0.8%. So I think it was a big problem for this population. So these are just two of the examples. So this is a female teenager with what we call cystic tuberculosis, because she had these massive cavities form, in different parts of her body. So these were on her tibia, her lower legs. But her whole body, poor thing, was ravaged with the disease, and she would have even had it in her face. So you can see again, she's been buried in an atypical position. You've got her hands are right up in front of her mouth, almost like she's praying. And I wondered, were her knees being drawn up like that again to mimic prayer, or was it maybe that this was a more comfortable position for her in life? But again, she would have needed a lot of care in life, and maybe that's why, her family gave her this special burial. This is another young adult woman. This time she had more classic lesions. So you can see a number of her lumbar vertebrae have collapsed. So they fuse together and then they basically collapse. So the abscesses form, eat away at the bone, causing it to collapse and then fuse. So you get like anterior curvature of the spine. And then you can see she also had these cavities in her pelvic bones. So she was pretty badly affected as well. So very nasty disease. Okay, so the final part of my lecture, I'm going to talk about violent death. So we had 7 cases at Ranelagh. This is just the radiocarbon profile. So they span the very earliest phases, so about the 5th to the 7th century, all the way up to about the 10th century. There was a few individuals seemed to have maybe be contemporary and maybe died around the same time. And one of them was a child. They were all male, and the child was a little boy. And we were able to find this out through DNA. But you can see there's 2 buried close together, and then the rest are quite scattered. But so this is quite a brutal section I'm going to talk about. So be prepared. Okay, so these are the 2 phase A, the earlier burials with evidence of violence. So skeleton 101, you can see, has been buried with no head, and you can see there wouldn't have been room in his grave for his head to have been put there, or hasn't moved away, so it's been taken, so presumably as some sort of a trophy. And he also had little fine cuts on the front of his neck vertebra, so it looks like he'd had his throat cut and then he was decapitated around the time of death. The 2 things happened. So the other early burial was skeleton 524, which is in some ways is even worse. So this time we've got another young man. He had been decapitated. There was cuts, lots of little fine cuts across his body, and it looks like they were maybe trying to sort of puncture his jugular vein. It looks like they were trying to cut away at his ribs to get access to his heart and his lungs. There were little fine cuts around his pelvis. So maybe they were trying to disembowel him, and there was even cuts in around his hips. So maybe they were even trying to take away his genitals. You can see here's like a puncture mark. There were cuts around one of his ankles. So it looks like they had to disable him. So they tried to sort of injure him so that he was incapacitated. So he had a very horrible treatment to his body around the time of his death. And it was interesting because there were a number of different weapons evident in the cuts. So it looks like the decapitation had been done with a heavy bladed implement, whereas the other cuts had been done with a much finer sort of implement. So maybe maybe they decapitated him, and then once he was dead, they were doing all these other things to him. Now, we do note sometimes that people have parts of their body buried separately, and that it would have been fashionable for the upper classes of Europe in the 12th century to maybe have an organ buried somewhere that was important to them, and then the rest of their body buried somewhere else. But I think in this case, because he did show, evidence of decapitation, it doesn't look like it was an honourable sort of use of his body. And I think the damage to his body probably is more to do with peri-mortem mutilation. And we do have other individuals from Ireland who seem to have had this extreme processing of their body. And Johnny Greber has worked on a site called Owenbristy. And there were very high levels of violence in this site. And he put forward the idea that maybe when you've got extreme violence like this, maybe there was some sort of like vengeance killing. So they had to then almost have like a ritualistic element, because maybe they had to sort of publicly show their anger and disgust, at the person. So maybe this person might have been an individual of high rank who'd been defeated or overthrown. And again, this sort of physical mutilation was almost like a parallel to their kind of removal from power. So there's lots of different ways of interpreting what was going on, but it wasn't nice. So if we move into phase B, this is skeleton 271, this individual here. And he had sort of this unusual peri-mortem sort of sharp force trauma at the back of his skull. So this is basically just right at the back of your head. And you can see there's almost like 3 different planes. So it looks like they were sort of shaving off part of his skull and presumably part of his hair, potentially even a ponytail at this area of the skull. So it's not a typical scalping pattern, which is usually like circumferential around the top of the skull. It seems to be very sort of localized and focused. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Skeleton 290, who is this individual here, he again showed a lot of different sort of pieces of trauma going on. So he looked like he had been formerly decapitated with his neck bent forward, because you can see all this damage to the back of his mandibles, and they get clipped if the head is bent forward and somebody's been decapitated. So you can see there's the cervical vertebrae with the cut marks. It had even nicked a piece of his skull. He also had then sort of a sharp cut at the top of his head. And then a bit similar to this, he had sort of nicks at the sort of occipital part. So it looked like not only had he been decapitated, that they'd done this sort of scalping thing on him as well. So again, it looks to me like they were trying to remove a bit of hair. You can see he's got earmuff stones, but you can also see his head is a little bit off center. So he's been put in sort of general anatomical order, but it's not quite perfect. And in both of these individuals, there were quartz pebbles. So again, the burials were undertaken with care. 518 then, so this was a middle-aged man, and again, he had similar sort of cuts, similar sort of injuries, again, damage to the angles of the mandible and evidence for decapitation. So again, it looked like, he'd been formally executed with his head forwards. Now, he also had a series of cuts on the front of his chin. So I think what was going on here was that they were trying to disfigure the man, or maybe they were trying to cut his beard off. He also had a fractured rib that was in the process of healing. So it's possible that he had been a prisoner in the run-up to his death, and he'd been badly treated, and then he was eventually executed. But again, he was buried in a Christian manner. This individual here, skeleton 242, is another middle-aged man. And again, he had this strange slicing at the back of his skull. He'd also been decapitated, but he seems to have died in quite a violent manner, because there was a lot of cuts on his legs, and one of them would have even sort of severed his forearm bones in 2. But I want to talk about him just in a minute. So we've got 3 individuals who seem to have had a portion of their hair removed from the back of their skulls, and one who may have had hair removed from their face. And again, if we look at the Irish sources, we get lots of references to hair, and there's a general feeling that there was a Celtic cult of the head. you know, and descriptions of the warriors in a lot of these tales, you know, they do focus on, you know, the colour and the style of the hair and the colour and style of the beards. And then they tend to go on to talk about other characteristics of their appearance. And we've got, you know, stories in the Ulster cycle that tell us that, you know, men's hair could be different lengths. It could be left hanging, it could be plaited, or it could be wound around the back of the head. We also know from the legal tracts that offences could be caused in relation to the hair. So we've got the Book of Achill, and it says, if half of his hair on the whole of his head, if half of his hair or the whole of his hair has been cut off a person, half the body fine and half compensation and full honour price shall be paid for it. And we know in other European cultures that a person, if they were tonsured, you know, with a bald patch, sort of a piece of hair cut off, that was a way of disqualifying a person from kingship. And we also get this suggestion in the Irish sources. So I think what we are seeing here is a way to humiliate and dishonour these men around the time they died. And this could also then apply to the facial hair, because again, you know, the adult warriors in the Irish sagas, they're often described as bearded, and there's a lot of detail about the length and style of their beards. You know, they could be forked or they could be unforked. So having a beard seems to have been a social signifier necessary to become a full warrior or even a king. And again, you know, offences could be caused to the beards or the whiskers of men, according to the legal tracts. So again, I think he was being dishonoured in the run-up to his death. So I just wanted to return to skeleton 242. So I've already explained how he died in a particularly frenzied attack, you know, that basically would have severed his right forearm and that he was decapitated. But you can see there's also evidence of charring in some of his bones. You can see his left arm, it's in what we call a pugilistic pose. So it's really, really tight up against his shoulder. And we think this is to do with heat distortion, because in forensic cases, the body quite often gets this strange kind of contracture, you know, due to the effect of heat on the muscles. So Millie Leroy and I, we did an archaeothanatological analysis of this burial because it was extremely complex and we didn't really know what was going on. But so we did the painstaking kind of work and looked at every joint and every part of the body. And we concluded that the man had been killed violently and had been decapitated. But then it seems that his body was partly burned and then it was wrapped in a shroud, because you can see there's kind of what we call walling effects, and that the skull is in a straight line with the arms. So it seems to have been kind of all bound together and then was buried at Ranelagh in this Christian manner. So we don't really know what happened, but it just looks like little bits of his body was burned. So he wasn't engulfed in flames. So maybe it was accidental burning on a battlefield or some sort of pyre. Maybe his body was retrieved from the pyre. But then there's also a suggestion that it could be related to status, because we know again in the historical sources that some kings were killed by means of the elements, including fire. So for example, in the Ulster cycle, King Conor Mór was burned to death in his house in Samhain. We know also in the 6th century, Murchart mac Urcha was burned to death on the eve of Samhain. So, I mean, these sources, they do talk about buildings being burnt down, you know, with the person inside them. But I wonder, is this some sort of a derivative practice? Don't know. Or maybe again, we're going back to this idea of deviant burial, and, you know, maybe they felt that this person was somebody to be feared, so they wanted to burn his body to sort of purify it or something. And maybe that's the same with the individual who was disemboweled and so dismembered. Maybe they were really trying to destroy their bodies for their afterlife. But one thing is that each of the different burials at Ranelagh that do show this extreme violence, you know, their communities still went to the effort to make sure that they had a formal burial. So while the osteological evidence, you know, it does give us a very graphic portrayal of the final moments of the lives of these individuals, and we can get lots of information about conflict. But then the manner in which they're actually buried, you know, it's much more within the arena of the family and community, you know, and the fact that we've got pieces of quartz, we've got, you know, earmuff stones, you know, I think, again, no matter how these individuals died, somebody buried them who was concerned about them, who cared for them. So my very last case, you'll be glad to know, I wanted to leave the little child for laugh, because I know this was definitely a case that did shock our whole team, you know, when we were analysing this individual. because it was quite shocking to find a child who had again been formally decapitated. So we've got a little boy who's only 7.5 to 9.5 years. He had classic signs of decapitation in his vertebra, and again, you know, his mandible had been affected, so it did look like he had been formally executed. So he'd received at least 4 blows, and they were made from quite a fine weapon. So I got a sense that the job was quite botched, you know, and maybe they were using too small an implement. So that made it even worse, I suppose. You can see he's been buried in anatomical order, and the head's in the normal position. So maybe it hadn't been fully detached, or maybe it was put back by whoever buried him. Now, he was buried with a range of grave goods. So he had a little bracelet with him, a flint flake, piece of quartz, and some worked animal bone. And he's put just in a typical sort of Christian manner. Now, this stone-lined pit is a lot later, so I think it's nothing to do with his burial. But you can see again, he's been given a respectful final burial, you know, presumably by his family and community. Now, this stone, initially I thought maybe it was, you know, something had fallen, but whenever we looked at the kind of patterning of the preservation of the body, it does look like it was a deliberate inclusion. And it's possible that we do go back to kind of this idea of fear of the dead. And maybe because the child died a violent and untimely death, there was a concern that he would come back to haunt the living, and maybe the stone was put on him to try to keep him in his grave. Now, we do have other examples of children with weapon trauma from Irish medieval sites, but I think these are usually individuals who seem to have been caught up in kind of battles or in raiding. This seems to be the youngest child to have been formally executed, and I suppose it is quite unusual because, again, we go back to our early medieval law tracts, and they said, you know, there would have been a serious penalty for the injury or causing the death of a child. And because he was older than 7, his honour price would have been half of that of his father. So what we think might have happened is that he might have been a hostage, because we have lots of references in the annals to hostages, typically the sons of kings or lords, and they would have been given over to rival rulers. So they were basically a sign of submission. So kings would have maybe taken hostages to ensure the loyalty of territory, you know, that they had claimed sovereignty over. And as long as things went well, the hostages were well treated. But if something happened, if there was any transgression, the hostage basically changed to their status to prisoner, and then they were liable to be killed, blinded, or ransomed. So I do wonder, was this little boy the son of somebody important, and that he was killed as part of a failed hostage arrangement? Now, we may think this is incredibly brutal, but there's a lot of stories in different historical sources about, you know, babies actually being killed violently. And we've got accounts of the Irish Rebellion of 1641, and it talks in quite a lot of detail about babies on both sides of the conflict being deliberately killed because of their parentage. So at the end, the results from Ranelagh, I think they have provided an important contribution to the growing body of information about medieval people, you know, both in Ireland and across Europe. So we can see, you know, that life would have been difficult for these people, you know, that they'd have been at risk of malnutrition quite a lot. There was lots of evidence of arduous sort of labour in these people. And, you know, I've talked just about some individuals, you know, with the individuals maybe with unusual burial configurations or particular diseases or injuries, but every single individual buried at Ranelagh had their own lived experience and story to tell, you know, from the tiniest baby to the oldest person. And I do think it's fair to say that all members of our team, you know, we did feel incredibly privileged to be able to study this important site and its people. Now, I've shown you at the end there some burials that really do show, you know, tales of violence and horror. But I hope I've also shown you that a lot more have positive emotions, you know, and these sort of show us, you know, the care and the community bonds that would have existed between these people during life, and then the reverence they would have shown in death. Now, I'm not the only person involved in Ranelagh. It was a massive team effort. And all of these individuals were involved as well. So, I mean, archaeology is generally a team effort, but in a big project like this, you've got so many individuals who are all really important parts of the team. So I think I've talked way longer than I should have, but that's it. do more? Did I do longer than Barry even?
Not quite. Eileen, that was absolutely amazing. And we talk about life and death in medieval Ireland. I mean, you've just shown us just how much can be learned from, none of us probably think so much when we visit a cemetery really about the actual lives of all these people. How much you can glean, from a set of bones that it's very specialist work, and it's just amazing the stories that you've brought out. It was all about these people who really, it just puts them in, in their place in the world, which they deserve. I mean, now that they've been disturbed, during this road scheme, but you've given them back a bit of their dignity, I think, and taught us so much about life in medieval Ireland. So it's absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Would you be prepared to take any questions?
Yes, people don't want to get home.
Anybody like to ask any questions? Yes.
You said there was no.
I can't remember what Ranelagh means, but there was nothing, because there's, people have done the research on the area, and there's a lot of local historians who have done a lot of in-depth work, but no. But I think sometimes we do forget that, there is like a lot of famine graves are sort of forgotten about in the landscape, and Ballyhannah, the big Donegal site I studied, had been sort of forgotten. So I don't know, maybe Courtney's looking at this as well, like maybe famine. There was a big sort of big severing of memory in Ireland, so maybe that's something that could have happened here too. But no, that's kind of the official line is there was nothing. So it's a strange thing. I absolutely, that's what I think, because they all do look like they've got care, and even that poor guy whose body must have been a mess, who was burned, the fact that he'd been wrapped up in some way was, yeah. Don't know for certain, but it does look like that, because you would imagine if they were enemies that they wouldn't have been getting that level of care, yeah. I don't know, but I mean, I've seen in other cemeteries, of different time periods in different places, you do get people who've fallen violently are given sort of formal burials. So you do get a sense that they must be able to get the bodies back. They're not being disrespected, unless you've got like a massive battle and then they're all just chucked into a pit, but that's you need to get Shane to come and give that lecture. I deliberately didn't put any pictures of artifacts because I knew there's so much to say about them as well. So yeah, get Shane. I think it probably, yeah. I mean, yeah, because like we've got historical pictures of Dublin, with heads on spikes, and in the archaeological record we've got a lot. But I suppose like but Ballyhannah, for example, which is a later medieval site, was one of the big cemeteries we've looked at. There was very little evidence of violence. There was no, there was no sort of obvious decapitation. So I just found Ranelagh, for me, it was quite unusual. But then people like Johnny Gebber have studied Owen Bristy, and he had even higher levels of violence and a lot of the, dismemberment and stuff that I've seen. So, yeah, so I think it was something just that happened, But the little boy was very shocking. There's no other parallels for him. You know, they would normally maybe be sort of warriors when they were about 14, when they reached adolescence, but he was too young for that. So I don't think. Well, the little boy was, yeah, but that's why I don't think he was. He would have still been a child. You know, you do get, there's adolescents in different sites across Ireland who've got violent injuries, you know, but that's kind of what you'd expect given the historical sources, because they were men, you know, like today they're not, but then they were grown-ups. But he was still too young, so that's why I think there's something different happened with him. But he was formally executed, you know, so something serious. It probably was political. That's why I think the hostages.
Yes, Barry.
Okay, well, the bones are still here. They're in our building. They're in this building. We've got them on loan from the National Museum for another 5 years, so we can get all the research sort of wrapped up and these different PhDs completed. Then they'll go to the museum, and then it's really up, because the legislation in the South considers human remains as objects, as archaeological objects, so they're under care of the state. But it's really up to communities then to sort of, if they want them back or want to rebury them, they have to put an argument forward. But they've been more mindful to bury, you know, 19th century, like Killeen populations. I don't know of any medieval populations that have been reburied yet, but so they're not you know, they're under the care really of the National Museum. So we've got them just on loan. They'll make the final decision. It sort of, it did a wedge shape, but you saw the geophysics, so there was the wedge and then there was all the enclosure. So there's still a lot of archaeological material there under the ground. And I think they thought they got most burials, but there could be potentially a few more. But yeah, the road's now just straight. So, but like I say, it was a massive excavation and they don't want to, you know, they'll dig the smallest area possible, you know, in these schemes. But well, I think they finished the actual excavation in the spring, and the road was it even operational that winter? You know, once the archaeologists, we're not popular because we slow down development, I'm afraid. But yeah, no, I think once the ground had all the remains were taken out, that they were able to get to work really quickly. As it was quite funny because I was down there a couple of years ago, and my sat nav or my Google whatever hadn't caught up, because it was still sort of veering me around the road. You could see it, and it hadn't caught up with the straight line. So it's quite interesting. But it's a lot safer now. Well, there's a couple of my students here in the audience as well. So, well, most of us we would do a degree in archaeology and then do a master's in, you know, some sort of osteoarchaeology. Although on those master's programs, that's where you really specialize. So you would also get anatomists and even medics or forensics people who kind of go into it. So it's really at that master's level you specialize, and then kind of that gives you the foundation, and then PhDs or whatever. But there's a lot of professional osteoarchaeologists working on the island. Lisa's sitting there who's done her master's and working on her PhD on prehistoric remains, and we'll be able to do a really interesting talk in a year or so. Prehistoric areas.
Yes, Sandra.
Mm-hmm.
Does that back up?
There's
Was that more recent?
What do you see? I don't know if you saw the work on the Bronze Age individuals from Rathlin Island, and it was showing, so there was a Neolithic individual and her DNA was more similar to modern Sardinians. And then the Bronze Age Rathlin people, their DNA was more similar to modern Irish and Scottish, but very different to English because of the sort of the Saxon, influences. So what we do see in the Irish populations is there's a lot of Scottish and it's a lot of mixing, like even Ballyhanna, which we haven't published this work or anything yet, but there's a lot of sort of Scottish influences in there. So it's kind of showing similar genetic stock going back to the Bronze Age, but then comes through in the medieval and comes through in us. So there's a lot more work being done on the archaeological population. So there'll be a lot kind of more refined information coming out about that.
Okay, please, yes.
I think there was, at some phases, there was evidence of houses in the settlement, but then there was a lot of ring forts. There was 17 or something just in the immediate hinterland. So it's thought that those were probably the people who were using the site. That's kind of, I think that's what it's sort of a place where they came together, these sort of assembly sites. So I think that's the theory, and probably just the amount of grain and the amount of animals and different things. It's too much maybe for one small family, the amount of bodies, amount of people, But you should read about it's quite a lot of grains and stuff. Probably could, but I don't know. No, it was quite a flat sort of plain. Yeah.
I mean, that whole area in Roscommon is absolutely bastard. And to everybody to go down, it's just absolutely coming down. Okay, anybody else? Final question? Well, thank you again, Eileen, on behalf of us all. I say that was an absolutely superb talk, and I think there's just so much of interest there, and extraordinary sight. And all I can say is I'm very glad that I didn't live in medieval Ireland.
No,
I think especially for the women wasn't a great time to be alive. But you really have to. So I think it just remains me to say have a very happy Christmas, festive season, whatever you get up to, and we'll see you in the new year, I hope, with lots more talks. So have a very, very good time, everybody.